Lars Jensen, Associate Professor of Cultural Encounters at Roskilde University. Welcome. Is there a post-colonial moment in Denmark at the moment?
There is. I mean, in some ways one can talk about post-colonial moments in Denmark as pearls on a string, but let's just talk briefly about this current one at the moment, which has to do very specifically with the centennial of the sale of the Danish West Indies to the US government in 1917. So that particular post-colonial moment, the way it pans out in Denmark at the moment, and obviously also in the US Virgin Islands, but I'm going to speak more specifically about the Danish case here, is that there's a whole range of activities. I mean, there's virtually something going on every week. I mean, this could be exhibitions, this can be seminars, and it's a kind of semi-grassroots based. So in a sense, most of the major Danish institutions are not really heavily involved in it because they have no funding for it. So at the same time, it means that there's a lot of actually kind of cross-cultural sort of scholarly interest in different disciplines for people working in university, in high school, in also people who are just affiliated through art circles, etc., etc. So it's a kind of interesting moment in that way, precisely perhaps because I think, because it's not, in a sense, it's not officially endorsed somehow. And that's interesting. But having said that, of course, I also said that it was like a pearl on a string. So we've kind of been there before. Not in exactly the same moment, of course, because this is the centennial, that's not happened before. But there have been moments before in the last 25 years when there has been exhibitions, etc., and there's been a particular focus on the US Virgin Islands. So it kind of comes and goes. And what I find interesting from my scholarly perspective, I suppose, is the way in which it kind of comes and goes, but it's very difficult to actually really get it solidly rooted as something we need to talk about, because it is something which involves not just Denmark historically, but it has something to do with who we are today as well. That particular part of it, I think, has been extremely difficult to get, let's say, up and running, because, of course, it's where it begins to hurt. It's where Denmark needs to recognize the fact that it was a colonizing power, that it was the, whatever, 6th or 7th largest slave trading nation in the world, and it was not, contrary to, in a sense, the popular discourse around it, it was not the first nation in the world to abolish slave trade, because what it actually did was that it said, yes, we'll stop it, but there'll be a moratorium, so let's let the plantation owners import a lot more slaves, and that way we can actually supply our own slaves. We don't have to import them anymore because actually it's too expensive. And that part of the story very seldom gets narrated. Typically, it's the moment when Denmark abolishes slave trade, and then it's the moment when Governor von Scholten in the Danish West Indies in 1848 decides to set the slaves free. Again, also that narrative is not really given, it's not told in the way where the slaves have any agency in the narrative. It's like the enlightened Danish good man who decides it is time to let go of this practice. So it's kind of two elements that I find interesting and troubling about this. One is that it becomes a whiteness narrative, that it takes away agency from the slaves, who were actually quite literally marching on the town at this time. And he abolished the slavery in a sense after consulting with the leader of the slaves, who sort of said, well, either we can have a bloodbath or we settle this in a peaceful manner, and that's what they did. And of course, the other part of it is that von Scholten had then to go home and face a court of treason for having acted outside his powers as governor. And he sort of had to, he retired and he died a few years later. So, and that part of it is kind of not really very often told about the story. It becomes the moment of emancipation by the Dane. That sort of, in a sense, is the moment that's left behind. I mean, and this is just, of course, talking about Denmark and the Danish West Indies, because we have to remember, of course, that there were the coastal possessions in Ghana, and there were colonies in India, of course, and then, of course, there was the North Atlantic, Iceland, Faroe Islands, and Greenland. So part of what I find is also interesting about this post-colonial moment is that it crops up in relation to these other places at different moments. So in relation to the Faroese, for instance, the Faroe Islands, you could go back to the year 2000, when there were negotiations between the Danish government and the Faroese government about a kind of transitional period towards independence. But the Danish government said, well, you can have the subsidies for 4 years, that'll be the end of it. and the Faroese realizing that there was no way that they could, in a sense, create an economy that would balance in 4 years' time, basically had to abolish the idea. So that would be a kind of post-colonial moment when that sort of, in a way, hit the national headlines about the Faroese. Greenland, of course, you could mention different moments. You could mention the year when the Thule people who were forced out of their homes in 1953 to make room for the expansion of the Thule Air Base, and it had to take until, I think, 1998, around that time, before the Danish government was finally had to acknowledge the fact that actually these people had not been asked, not been consulted, but they had just been shifted out because the Americans wanted that extra space. And so the Danish government decided that out you go, and they burnt the houses after they moved out, lest they get the idea that they could go back again. So that's at least one particular moment about the post-colonial moment in relation to Greenland. And then, of course, there are moments that I find are the most interesting one where it cuts across. So say when you have representatives from civil society in US Virgin Islands coming to Denmark, which they've been doing over the last few years, and calling for reconciliation as part also of the reparations movement in the Caribbean. And at the same time, you have actually the Greenlandic government establishing a reconciliation commission in Greenland itself, to which the Danish Prime Minister said, well, that's fine if they want that, we don't need that. So basically, Denmark just kept out of it as if the reconciliation was only about Greenlanders themselves. It had nothing to do with the Danish presence in Greenland and the modernization period, and in a sense, the imposition of Danish rules and ideas and ways of regarding the way in which society should be structured, without any idea about that maybe we should consult the locals about this and ask them what their ideas might have been. So this is a way of talking about this kind of pearl strings of post-colonial moments in relation to the different parts of the Danish Empire.
Thank you. Few Scandinavian Nordic nations have wanted to own up to their colonial legacy. And Denmark is, as you describe here, a very good case in point.
Yeah. What
would it mean for Denmark to own up to its colonial background? For the other Nordic nations? What do you think would be the consequence of officially recognizing that colonial past?
Well, in some ways, of course, as I was indicating before, I mean, it's easy to see that owning up to the fact that being a slave trading nation is, means that you have to change the way in which you look at yourself. But at the same time, I also believe that if you don't do that, you're kind of living a lie. Because if you are living on the idea that you were the white enlightened nation that somehow had possessions and somehow got involved in slave trade, but although it's very difficult to see it, except that when they set them free, right? But somebody must have started at some point, otherwise there wouldn't have been any slaves to set free. So Denmark, in that sense, I think ironically actually would gain a lot from that. It would get a lot of insight, I think, both in terms of looking at the history in a different light. It actually also makes Denmark a far more globalized nation, which I think would be a kind of interesting counter-narrative to the kind of extremely nationalistic, territorial bound narratives about Denmark that are very, very prominent in Denmark, but not just in Denmark, but across Europe, right? In places like Poland and Hungary, Netherlands and so forth, we hear these same kind of nationalistic voices. And actually, I think, ironically, this kind of critical view might, in a way, blow these kind of narratives out of the water. So I guess part of my answer to your question is also that what I find is interesting that in some ways there are overlaps between the different Nordic countries that are interesting to explore, because Nordic countries, certainly in the 20th century, have built to a large extent on the same narrative of the welfare state. In that particular Nordic model frame, which is very different from other parts of Europe, say in the UK, where they also talk about the welfare state, but actually I don't think they ever had one. So that's their lie, I suppose. But so part of it is in a way where you can constructively look across this kind of engagement, that when you begin to re-examine that colonial history in the light of this welfare state narrative, how does that look, right? How have we treated people inside the welfare state compared to, in a sense, this kind of legacy of colonialism and subjectivities and the colonial archives, the way in which we think about people who are different, etc., etc. That is, I think, something that we all, in a sense, gain from exploring, regardless of where you are in the Nordic countries. And here, I think, Denmark, because in a sense it was the country that had the biggest overseas empire of colonial subjects across the world. So because of that, I think Denmark is in a unique position. I don't mean to say that in such a way. I think that the other Nordic countries should learn a lot from the Danish experience. I think perhaps they should learn from the Danish silence and take as a point of departure to sort of look at the ways in which you can look at Swedish history, you can look at Norwegian history and Icelandic history and say, what are the parallels and differences between the ways in which we have failed to engage colonialism as a kind of legacy about the way in which we think about our own place in the world historically, but also contemporarily, in terms of the migration crisis, in terms of the refugee crisis, which I always say is not really a refugee crisis, it's actually a crisis about refugees, because it's really the European countries that have a crisis about the reception of this, in a sense, relatively small amount of people coming across from the Middle East and coming across from North Africa, given that from this country here, for instance, that we're in at the moment, 1 million people migrated in the late 19th century and the 250,000 Danes. So, I mean, imagine that they had had the same sort of reception that we are giving to refugees and migrants now.
Thank you.